Picture this. You're standing in the opulent halls of Versailles in 1685, surrounded by the most powerful and wealthy people in all of Europe. The golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk tapestries worth more than entire villages. Nobles in elaborate wigs and jewel-encrusted gowns glide across marble floors, their laughter echoing through chambers that have witnessed centuries of royal intrigue. But then something hits you, a smell so overwhelming, so putrid, that you have to cover your nose with a perfumed handkerchief just to breathe. Welcome to the shocking reality behind the glittering facade of French nobility, where the most powerful people in the world lived in conditions that would horrify even the poorest peasant today. You're about to discover hygiene's secrets so disturbing, so utterly revolting, that they'll forever change how you think about history's most glamorous era. The truth about how French aristocrats really lived will make your skin crawl and your stomach turn. Before diving into these forgotten secrets of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of historical oddities. This is the story of how an entire civilization convinced itself that filth was fashionable, that disease was divine punishment, and that the most basic human needs for cleanliness were actually dangerous to their health. The French nobility didn't just tolerate disgusting conditions, they actively created and celebrated them, turning personal hygiene into a twisted art form that would make modern germaphobes faint on the spot. Let's start with the most fundamental shock. French aristocrats were absolutely terrified of water. Not just any water, all water. They believed with religious fervor that bathing would literally kill them, that submersion in water would open their pores and allow deadly diseases to invade their bodies like microscopic armies. This wasn't ignorance, this was official medical doctrine, prescribed by the finest physicians in Europe and followed religiously by people who could afford the best of everything. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, the most powerful monarch in European history, took exactly 3 baths in his entire 77-year lifespan. 3. The man who built Versailles, who commanded armies across continents, who shaped the destiny of nations, was so terrified of soap and water that he spent decades accumulating layers of grime and sweat that would make a medieval peasant seem pristine by comparison. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Louis didn't just avoid bathing, he turned his filth into a public spectacle. Every morning, the King of France would undergo an elaborate ritual called the lever, where dozens of the highest-ranking nobles in the kingdom would gather to watch him get dressed. They would stand in reverent silence as servants approached His Majesty with perfumed cloths soaked in alcohol, watching as they wiped down his unwashed body with the same ceremony reserved for religious rites. The process was methodical and grotesque. First, servants would scrub the king's face with a cloth dampened in wine, not to clean it, but to purify it according to medical theories that made absolutely no sense. Then they would rub his arms, chest, and legs with alcohol-soaked linens, believing this would somehow remove the dangerous humors that accumulated on his skin overnight. The smell must have been indescribable. Imagine the concentrated funk of months' worth of sweat and dead skin, masked by cheap perfume and fermented grape juice. The nobility watching this daily degradation didn't recoil in horror. They fought for the privilege of witnessing it. Being invited to the king's morning cleaning ritual was considered one of the highest honors at court. Dukes and counts would arrive hours early, dressed in their finest silks and satins, just to watch a grown man get wiped down like a dirty table. They would whisper among themselves about the quality of the perfumes being used, critique the technique of the servants, and compete for the honor of handing the king his fresh shirt. Because that was the other shocking secret of French noble hygiene. They changed their clothes constantly while never washing their bodies. Louis XIV would go through multiple shirts per day, sometimes as many as 6 or 7, each one more elaborately decorated than the last. These weren't simple linen tunics. These were masterpieces of textile art, embroidered with gold thread, decorated with pearls and precious stones, each one worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But here's the truly revolting part. Those beautiful shirts were being put on an unwashed body that hadn't seen soap and water in months. Imagine the finest silk in Europe, woven by master craftsmen, dyed with exotic pigments from distant lands, being pulled over skin caked with weeks of accumulated filth. The contrast must have been surreal. Exquisite fabric touching flesh that would have been rejected by any modern homeless shelter. The French nobility had convinced themselves that this was not just acceptable, but actually superior to the bathing practices of other cultures. When French ambassadors visited the Ottoman Empire or encountered Byzantine customs during diplomatic missions, they would return home horrified by what they called the obsessive washing rituals of foreign courts. They genuinely believed that Europeans who bathed regularly were weakening themselves, making their bodies vulnerable to diseases that proper French nobles could resist through the protective power of accumulated grime. This wasn't just personal preference. This was a complete medical philosophy that shaped every aspect of noble life. French court physicians had developed elaborate theories about how the human body worked, theories that would seem like dark comedy if they hadn't caused so much suffering. They believed that human skin was like a sponge, absorbing whatever it came into contact with. Clean water, they argued, would wash away the body's natural protective oils, while simultaneously allowing dangerous miasmas, poisonous air, to penetrate through enlarged pores. The solution, according to these learned doctors, was to keep the skin constantly coated with a protective layer of natural oils, sweat, and dead skin cells. This biological armor, they claimed, would shield the body from external threats while preserving the internal humors that kept a person healthy. Bathing would strip away this protection, leaving aristocrats vulnerable to the same diseases that plagued common people who couldn't afford proper medical care. Of course, this medical theory had some rather obvious flaws that even medieval peasants could have pointed out. The most glaring problem was that French nobles were constantly getting sick, not from bathing since they never did it, but from the infections and diseases that thrived in their unwashed bodies. Skin conditions were endemic among the aristocracy. Rashes, boils, and mysterious pustules were so common that court physicians had developed an entire vocabulary to describe different types of noble rot. But rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions about hygiene, French medical authorities doubled down on their theories. When aristocrats developed painful skin infections, doctors prescribed more alcohol rubs and stronger perfumes. When nobles suffered from digestive problems often caused by the toxic cosmetics and medicinal concoctions they consumed, physicians recommended avoiding water even more strictly. It was a medical system designed to perpetuate the very problems it claimed to solve. The daily routine of a French aristocrat was a carefully choreographed dance of filth management that would seem like satire if it weren't so well documented. Take the Duchess of Burgundy, one of the most fashionable women at Louis XIV's court. Her morning routine began at dawn with servants approaching her bed, carrying silver trays loaded with perfumed cloths, aromatic oils, and various powders designed to mask the smell of her unwashed body. First, her ladies-in-waiting would carefully lift the Duchess from her bed, a process that required considerable skill, since her nightgown would be soaked with sweat and other bodily fluids accumulated during the night. The bed linens, which were changed weekly if she was lucky, would be bundled up and removed by servants wearing perfumed masks to protect them from the stench. Next came the purification ritual. The Duchess would stand naked in the center of her chamber, while servants approached with cloths soaked in a mixture of wine, rosewater, and alcohol. They would systematically wipe down every inch of her body, paying special attention to areas where odors tended to concentrate. The process took over an hour and required a team of 6 servants working in careful coordination. But here's where the ritual becomes truly grotesque. The cloths used for this cleaning were never washed. They were simply wrung out and used again the next day, accumulating layers of human filth that would eventually become so saturated with bodily fluids that they had to be burned. The smell of these cleaning cloths was so overwhelming that servants would often faint while handling them, leading to the development of special aromatic salts designed to revive unconscious staff members. After the cleaning ritual came the perfuming ceremony, an elaborate process that involved applying dozens of different scents to various parts of the Duchess's body. Her hair would be doused with rose oil imported from Bulgaria. Her neck and wrist would be rubbed with ambergris, a waxy substance extracted from whale intestines that cost more than gold. Her underarms would be packed with sachets of lavender and mint, designed to mask the smell of sweat that would begin accumulating within hours. The final step was dressing, a process that could take 3 hours and required the cooperation of an entire team of servants, seamstresses, and fashion consultants. The Duchess would be wrapped in layer after layer of expensive fabric, silk chemises, velvet bodices, embroidered overskirts, each one more elaborate than the last. The goal wasn't just to look magnificent, but to create a barrier between her unwashed body and the outside world, a portable prison of luxury that would contain her stench while projecting an image of refinement and wealth. By the time this daily ritual was complete, the Duchess of Burgundy would emerge from her chambers looking like a vision from a fairy tale, perfectly coiffed, exquisitely dressed, radiating wealth and power. But underneath all that finery was a human being who hadn't properly washed in months, whose skin was caked with layers of dried sweat and dead cells, whose body odor was so intense that it could be detected from across a large room despite the gallons of perfume applied to mask it. And this wasn't considered shameful or disgusting by the standards of the time. This was the height of sophistication, the pinnacle of civilized behavior that other European courts desperately tried to emulate. French hygiene practices became the gold standard for aristocratic refinement, copied by nobles from England to Russia who believed that smelling like a French courtier was the ultimate mark of social status. The economic implications of this lifestyle were staggering. The French nobility was spending incredible amounts of money that could have fed entire provinces on elaborate systems designed to manage their own filth. Perfume merchants became some of the wealthiest traders in Europe, selling exotic scents to aristocrats who went through bottles of the stuff like modern people go through soap. The competition between different regions of France to supply the royal court with aromatic products became so intense that it shaped agricultural practices across the entire kingdom. Grasse and Montpellier, two regions in southern France, engaged in what historians call the perfume wars, a commercial battle to see who could produce the most exotic and expensive scents for the royal court. Entire hillsides were converted to growing jasmine, lavender, and other aromatic plants. New trade routes were established to import rare ingredients from Asia and the Americas. The French perfume industry, which still dominates global markets today, was built on the foundation of aristocratic body odor and the desperate need to mask it. But the most shocking aspect of this system wasn't the waste of money or the medical ignorance, it was the complete lack of privacy that accompanied every aspect of noble hygiene. French aristocrats didn't just avoid bathing in private. They turned their most intimate bodily functions into public spectacles that would horrify modern sensibilities in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. The toilet habits of French nobility represent perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of their twisted relationship with hygiene. Picture this. You're a visiting diplomat to Versailles, and you've been granted the extraordinary honor of a private audience with Louis XIV himself. You're escorted through marble corridors lined with priceless artwork, past guards in elaborate uniforms into the most sacred chambers of European power. And there, seated on an ornate chair that looks suspiciously like a toilet, is the most powerful man in the world, conducting affairs of state while relieving himself. This wasn't a breach of protocol or an emergency situation. This was standard operating procedure. French kings regularly held court while seated on their close stools, ornate portable toilets that were considered pieces of furniture as important as thrones. The position of groom of the king's close stool was one of the most coveted jobs in the entire palace, typically given to sons of the highest nobility who competed fiercely for the privilege of attending to their monarch's most intimate needs. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. These weren't private moments of vulnerability. The king's bathroom breaks were social events, complete with audiences, political discussions, and elaborate etiquette governing who could speak when and about what topics. Imagine trying to negotiate a treaty or discuss military strategy while the person you're talking to is actively defecating just feet away from you, and you'll begin to understand the surreal nature of French court life. The close stool itself was a masterpiece of expensive craftsmanship that perfectly embodied the French noble approach to hygiene. Elaborate decoration covering up fundamental filth. These portable toilets were works of art, carved from the finest woods, upholstered in silk and velvet, decorated with gold leaf and precious stones. The king's personal close stool was worth more than most people's houses, a gleaming monument to the French aristocracy's ability to make even human waste seem aristocratic. The ritual surrounding the use of these devices was so complex, it required specialized training. The groom of the close stool had to master dozens of specific procedures, how to position the chair, when to offer reading material, how to dispose of waste, and most importantly, how to maintain the pretense that nothing disgusting was happening while standing in a room that reeked of human excrement. After the king finished his business, the groom would carefully clean him using soft cloths soaked in rose water, not because cleanliness was important, but because the ritual demanded it. The waste would then be examined by court physicians who believed they could diagnose the monarch's health by studying the color, consistency, and smell of his bowel movements. These medical consultations often took place in front of the same nobles who had just witnessed the waste being produced, creating a grotesque theater of scatological analysis that somehow passed for sophisticated medical care. The disposal of royal waste was itself a ceremony steeped in bizarre traditions. The contents of the king's close stool couldn't simply be dumped into the same sewers used by servants. That would be beneath royal dignity. Instead, specially appointed waste carriers would ceremoniously transport the royal excrement to designated areas of the palace grounds, where it would be buried with more care than most commoners received at their funerals. But the king's toilet habits were just the beginning of the French nobility's twisted relationship with bodily functions. The entire palace of Versailles operated according to principles that would seem like comedy if they weren't so well documented. With thousands of courtiers, servants, and hangers-on packed into the palace complex, the logistics of human waste management became a nightmare that no amount of French ingenuity could solve. The hallways of Versailles regularly served as public restrooms for nobles who couldn't be bothered to find proper facilities. Visitors reported stepping over human waste on marble floors that had cost fortunes to install. Staircases reeked of urine from courtiers who had relieved themselves on the steps, rather than interrupt important conversations to find a chamber pot. The most beautiful palace in Europe had become, quite literally, a giant toilet where thousands of people lived, worked, and defecated in the same spaces. The problem became so severe that palace staff developed an entire infrastructure devoted to managing human waste. Teams of servants called muckrackers worked around the clock, cleaning up after nobles who treated the palace like their personal bathroom. These workers wore special masks soaked in aromatic oils to protect them from the overwhelming stench, and they were paid extra wages because the job was considered so disgusting that even desperate servants would quit rather than continue. The palace had to be regularly evacuated and fumigated to remain habitable. When the smell became unbearable, and we're talking about people who already lived in conditions that would gag modern sewage workers, the entire court would pack up and move to a different royal residence while teams of cleaners attempted to restore Versailles to minimally acceptable conditions. During these cleaning operations, workers would discover things that defied belief. Hidden corners of the palace were found to contain months' worth of accumulated human waste, left by nobles who had used alcoves and storage rooms as improvised toilets. Valuable tapestries had to be burned because they were so saturated with urine and feces that no amount of cleaning could save them. Marble floors were permanently stained with bodily fluids that had soaked so deeply into the stone that they couldn't be removed without destroying the artwork itself. The waste management crisis at Versailles was so notorious that other European courts began making jokes about French refinement. Visiting diplomats from England, Germany, and Italy would return home with stories about the magnificent palace that smelled like a sewer, about nobles in silk gowns stepping over human excrement, about the most powerful court in Europe that couldn't solve the basic problem of where people should relieve themselves. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this situation was how the French nobility responded to criticism. Rather than acknowledging the obvious problems with their lifestyle, they developed elaborate philosophical justifications for why their approach to waste management was actually superior to the practices of other cultures. French court intellectuals wrote treatises arguing that the natural accumulation of human waste created a healthy environment that strengthened the immune system and provided protection against foreign diseases. They claimed that courts with proper sanitation were actually weakening themselves by eliminating the beneficial bacteria that came from exposure to human waste. This wasn't fringe thinking. These ideas were embraced by some of the finest minds in France, including physicians, philosophers, and scientists who should have known better, but had become so committed to defending French practices that they lost all connection to reality. The situation became even more absurd when French nobles began competing to see who could tolerate the most disgusting conditions. Living comfortably amid filth became a mark of sophistication, a way of demonstrating that you were too refined and aristocratic to be bothered by the same bodily concerns that troubled common people. Nobles would boast about sleeping in beds that hadn't been cleaned in months, about wearing clothes soaked with their own bodily fluids, about enduring smells that would make peasants vomit. This competitive filthiness reached its peak during elaborate court ceremonies where hundreds of unwashed nobles would gather in enclosed spaces for hours at a time. The smell at these events was so overwhelming that servants would faint from the fumes, and visiting dignitaries would become physically ill from the concentrated stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies packed together in rooms with no ventilation. But the French court had a solution for this problem too: more perfume. Vast quantities of aromatic substances would be deployed during major ceremonies, creating a sickening mixture of human waste and floral scents that somehow managed to be even more nauseating than simple body odor. Guests at these events reported feeling dizzy and nauseous from the competing smells, but they were expected to maintain perfect composure while breathing air that was essentially a toxic cloud of human filth and expensive aromatics. The servants who worked in these conditions developed health problems that were directly related to their constant exposure to waste and toxic perfumes. Respiratory illnesses were endemic among palace staff, skin conditions were universal, and the life expectancy of people who worked closely with the nobility was significantly lower than that of ordinary peasants who lived in much more sanitary conditions. Yet none of this suffering seemed to register with the French aristocracy, who had become so disconnected from basic human needs that they genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would object to living in conditions that were literally killing the people around them. They had created a bubble of wealth and privilege so complete that they lost the ability to recognize their own degradation. The economic costs of maintaining this lifestyle were staggering beyond belief. The French monarchy was spending enormous sums of money on elaborate systems designed to make filth tolerable rather than simply eliminating it. They imported exotic perfumes from around the world, employed armies of servants to clean up after them, and constantly replaced furnishings and decorations that had been ruined by their own bodily functions. The money that could have built hospitals, schools, or infrastructure improvements was instead being poured into an endless cycle of waste management and odor control that benefited no one except the merchants who sold aromatic products to desperate aristocrats. The irony was lost on the French nobility. They were bankrupting themselves to maintain a lifestyle that made them sicker, smellier, and more disgusting with each passing year. But the true horror of French noble hygiene wasn't just the waste and the stench. It was what happened to the women who were trapped in this system. Female aristocrats faced challenges that would break the spirit of anyone forced to endure them. Challenges that went far beyond simple discomfort and entered the realm of genuine torture. Consider the plight of the Marquise de Maintenon, one of the most powerful women at Louis XIV's court. As the king's secret wife, she was expected to maintain an appearance of perfection at all times, while following the same anti-bathing protocols that governed the rest of the nobility. But women's clothing in this era was designed in ways that made basic hygiene nearly impossible, even under the best circumstances. The Marquise wore corsets so tight they compressed her internal organs, making normal breathing difficult and digestion nearly impossible. These corsets were never removed. She slept in them, ate in them, and conducted all her daily activities while being slowly crushed by whalebone and steel that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The fabric of these undergarments would become saturated with sweat, blood from where the stays cut into her skin, and other bodily fluids that accumulated over weeks of constant wear. On top of the corset came layers of increasingly elaborate clothing: chemises, petticoats, overskirts, each one adding to the weight and complexity of her daily costume. By the time she was fully dressed, the Marquise was wearing nearly 40 pounds of fabric, much of it contaminated with the accumulated filth of previous wearings. The outermost layers might be changed regularly, but the undergarments closest to her skin could go months without being replaced. The result was a walking nightmare of bacterial infection and skin disease. Women at the French court developed rashes and sores that never healed because they were constantly irritated by dirty clothing that couldn't be removed. Fungal infections thrived in the warm, moist environment created by layers of unwashed fabric. Some noblewomen developed open wounds that became infected and never properly healed, creating permanent sources of pain and odor that no amount of perfume could mask. But the physical suffering was nothing compared to the psychological torture of the menstrual cycles that these women had to endure. In an era before modern sanitary products, managing monthly bleeding was challenging enough for peasant women who could at least wash themselves and their clothing. For aristocratic women who were forbidden to bathe and couldn't remove their elaborate costumes, menstruation became a monthly horror that defied description. French noblewomen used rags and cloth strips to absorb menstrual blood, but these materials could never be properly cleaned. according to court hygiene protocols. The same alcohol and perfume cleaning methods that were supposed to purify everything else were applied to menstrual cloths, creating a toxic mixture that caused chemical burns and infections. Women would suffer through their periods while wearing contaminated rags held in place by tight corsets, unable to change or clean themselves for days at a time. The smell during these periods was so overwhelming that even other nobles, people who were accustomed to the most horrific odors, would avoid being near menstruating women. Special perfuming ceremonies were developed specifically for noble women during their monthly cycles, involving the application of even stronger aromatics to try to mask the smell of blood and infection that surrounded them like a cloud. Some women developed infections so severe that they became permanently ill, suffering from conditions that modern medicine would easily treat, but that 17th century physicians interpreted as moral failings or supernatural punishments. The connection between poor hygiene and infection was so obvious that even medieval peasants understood it. But French court physicians had developed such elaborate theories about the dangers of cleanliness that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. The childbirth experiences of French noblewomen were particularly horrific because they combined all the worst aspects of court hygiene with the already dangerous process of giving birth in an era before modern medicine. When the Duchess of Orléans went into labor, she did so while wearing the same unwashed undergarments she had been wearing for weeks, in a room that reeked of accumulated filth, attended by physicians whose hands hadn't been properly washed in months. The birthing process itself was conducted according to protocols that prioritized court etiquette over basic sanitation. Dozens of nobles would crowd into the birthing chamber to witness the delivery, not to provide support or assistance, but because royal births were considered public events that required aristocratic witnesses. These spectators would stand for hours in an unventilated room filled with the smells of blood, bodily fluids, and unwashed bodies, creating conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. The newborn babies born into this environment faced challenges that no infant should have to endure. They were immediately wrapped in fabrics that hadn't been properly cleaned, handled by people whose hands were contaminated with months of accumulated filth, and fed by wet nurses whose own hygiene was governed by the same anti-bathing protocols that affected everyone else at court. Infant mortality rates among French nobility were catastrophically high, not because of genetic problems or lack of medical care, but because babies were literally being poisoned by the environment they were born into. Many children developed infections within days of birth that modern medicine could easily prevent. But French physicians interpreted these deaths as God's will, rather than recognizing the connection to their own hygiene practices. The psychological impact on mothers who watched their children die from preventable infections was devastating, but court protocol didn't allow for proper grieving. Noblewomen were expected to maintain their elaborate beauty routines and social obligations, even while mourning the loss of children who had died because of the very lifestyle they were required to maintain. This cycle of suffering was so normalized that French aristocrats genuinely couldn't understand why other cultures found their practices disgusting. When Marie Antoinette arrived from Austria with her foreign ideas about regular bathing, she was initially viewed with suspicion and contempt by established French nobles who saw her cleanliness as a sign of weakness and foreign corruption. Marie Antoinette's bathing habits became a source of political controversy that contributed to the revolutionary fervor that would eventually cost her life. Her enemies used her commitment to cleanliness as evidence that she was too foreign to be a proper French queen, too soft to understand the sophisticated traditions that had made France the dominant power in Europe. The same hygiene practices that would seem obviously beneficial to modern people were twisted into weapons against a woman who was already fighting for her political survival. The elaborate bathing rituals that Marie Antoinette established at Versailles were revolutionary by French standards, involving actual submersion in water, a practice so shocking that court physicians warned it would kill her. She had to wear a full-length linen gown while bathing to maintain some semblance of modesty in front of the dozens of servants and nobles who were required to witness even this most private activity. The queen's bathwater was infused with expensive aromatics, sweet almonds, pine nuts, lily bulbs, and other exotic ingredients that cost more than most people earned in a year. But even these luxurious additions couldn't disguise the fact that she was doing something that violated every principle of French aristocratic medicine. Court physicians predicted that her bathing habits would weaken her immune system and make her vulnerable to diseases that proper French nobles could resist. When Marie Antoinette's enemies wanted to attack her character, they focused on her Austrian cleanliness rather than any real political failings. Pamphlets distributed by revolutionaries mocked her bathing habits as evidence of foreign decadence, claiming that her obsession with washing proved she was too weak and feminine to understand the masculine virtues that had made France great. The irony was overwhelming. In a court where people literally lived in their own filth, cleanliness was being portrayed as a character flaw. The propaganda against Marie Antoinette's hygiene practices reveals just how deeply the French nobility had internalized their dysfunctional relationship with cleanliness. They had convinced themselves that their lifestyle represented the pinnacle of human civilization, that their ability to tolerate disgusting conditions was a mark of sophistication that separated them from lesser peoples who were obsessed with primitive concerns like washing. This delusion was so complete that French nobles genuinely believed other European courts envied their hygiene practices. They thought that visitors who recoiled in horror at the conditions in Versailles were simply too unsophisticated to appreciate the refined complexity of French court life. When foreign ambassadors reported back to their own governments about the shocking filth they had witnessed, French officials dismissed these accounts as jealous lies spread by inferior cultures that couldn't match French achievements. The dental hygiene of French nobility deserves special mention because it represents perhaps the most visible and horrifying aspect of their approach to personal care. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, he was completely toothless, not because of old age, but because of dental practices that would seem like medieval torture if they weren't so well documented. French nobles used a variety of substances to clean their teeth, but none of them actually worked, and most made the problems worse. They rubbed their teeth with mixtures of ash, vinegar, and various herbs that stripped away enamel and caused chemical burns in their mouths. They used metal picks to scrape away tartar, often damaging their gums so severely that they developed infections that spread throughout their bodies. The dentists who served the French court were actually barbers who had no understanding of dental anatomy or disease. They would extract teeth using crude tools and no anesthesia, often removing healthy teeth along with diseased ones because they couldn't tell the difference. The pain from these procedures was so intense that patients would often pass out from shock, but this was considered normal and expected. The breath of French nobles was so horrific that special etiquette developed around how to conduct conversations without being overwhelmed by dental odors. Courtiers learned to speak while holding perfumed handkerchiefs near their faces, and social interactions were structured to minimize close contact between people whose mouths were essentially open wounds filled with rotting teeth and infected gums. The irony was that French nobles had access to the finest foods in Europe, but their dental problems made eating so painful that many survived on liquid diets or foods that had been pre-chewed by servants. The same people who could afford the most elaborate banquets often couldn't properly chew their food because their mouths were destroyed by hygiene practices that had been designed to preserve their health. Tooth extraction became such a common procedure that it was considered a routine part of aristocratic life rather than a medical emergency. Nobles would have multiple teeth pulled in single sessions, leaving them with mouths so damaged that normal speech became difficult. Some developed lisps or other speech impediments that affected their ability to participate in court life, but they were expected to maintain their social obligations regardless of their physical condition. The psychological impact of living with constant dental pain was severe, but French medical theory didn't recognize the connection between oral health and mental state. Nobles who became irritable or depressed because of chronic tooth pain were diagnosed with various spiritual ailments rather than physical ones, leading to treatments that made their suffering worse rather than better. The waste of human potential represented by these hygiene practices was staggering. Some of the most intelligent and capable people in Europe were living in conditions that prevented them from functioning at their full capacity, but they had become so committed to defending their lifestyle that they couldn't recognize their own decline. The French court, which should have been the center of European civilization, had become a monument to the human capacity for self-destruction through willful ignorance. The end of this bizarre chapter in human history came not through medical enlightenment, but through political revolution. When the French Revolution swept away the old aristocracy, it also eliminated the social structures that had maintained these dysfunctional hygiene practices. The new revolutionary government, whatever its other failings, at least understood that cleanliness was a basic human need rather than a dangerous foreign innovation. But the legacy of French noble hygiene practices extended far beyond the political upheaval that ended them. These traditions had influenced European court culture for centuries, spreading dysfunctional ideas about cleanliness to aristocracies across the continent. The damage done by these practices to individual health, to medical understanding, and to basic human dignity took generations to repair. The story of French noble hygiene serves as a reminder of how societies can convince themselves that obviously harmful practices are actually beneficial, how the powerful can become so isolated from reality that they lose the ability to recognize their own degradation. It shows us that wealth and education are no protection against willful ignorance, and that the most sophisticated civilizations can harbor the most primitive delusions. Most importantly, it demonstrates the human cost of systems that prioritize tradition over truth, status over health, and political convenience over basic human welfare. The French nobles who lived and died in their own filth weren't victims of primitive ignorance. They were casualties of a culture that had become so committed to defending its practices that it lost sight of their purpose. The perfumed halls of Versailles may have dazzled visitors with their beauty, but underneath all that splendor was a rotting foundation of human misery that no amount of gold leaf could disguise. The shocking hygiene secrets of French nobility reveal not just the strange customs of a distant era, but the eternal human tendency to mistake suffering for sophistication, degradation for refinement, and elaborate self-deception for wisdom. Today, as we wash our hands dozens of times and shower daily without a second thought, it's almost impossible to comprehend how an entire civilization could have gotten something so basic, so catastrophically wrong. The French nobility didn't just make poor hygiene choices, they created an elaborate philosophy that turned filth into virtue and suffering into sophistication. The most disturbing aspect of this story isn't the disgusting conditions themselves, but how intelligent, educated people convinced themselves that obvious madness was actually genius. French court physicians weren't ignorant peasants. They were the most learned men of their time, trained in the finest universities, consulted by kings and emperors. Yet they developed medical theories so divorced from reality that they prescribed practices which would have been rejected by Bronze Age farmers. This wasn't accidental ignorance. This was willful delusion on a massive scale. When evidence contradicted their theories, they didn't question their assumptions. Instead, they created even more elaborate explanations for why their obviously failing system was actually working perfectly. When nobles died from infections that proper hygiene could have prevented, physicians blamed supernatural forces rather than admitting that their anti-bathing protocols might be flawed. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this delusion to persist are the same ones we see operating in societies throughout history. When people invest their identity in a particular belief system, they become capable of ignoring overwhelming evidence that contradicts their worldview. The French nobility had built their entire sense of superiority around the idea that their practices represented the pinnacle of civilization. Admitting that they were wrong about hygiene would have meant admitting that their entire culture was built on a foundation of lies. So they doubled down, creating increasingly elaborate justifications for practices that were literally killing them. They turned their suffering into a badge of honor, their degradation into a mark of sophistication. The ability to tolerate disgusting conditions became proof of aristocratic breeding rather than evidence of medical ignorance. The servants who worked in these conditions understood the reality better than their masters, but they had no power to change anything. They could see the connection between filth and disease, between poor hygiene and suffering, but they were trapped in a system that punished truth-telling and rewarded those who maintained comfortable lies. The people with the most direct experience of the consequences were the ones with the least ability to influence policy. This created a feedback loop of dysfunction that perpetuated itself for generations. Each new cohort of nobles was raised to believe that their elders' practices represented wisdom accumulated over centuries. They learned to interpret their own suffering as character building rather than recognizing it as the predictable result of harmful behaviors. The system became self-reinforcing, immune to criticism from within and dismissive of challenges from without. The economic waste represented by these practices was staggering in ways that go beyond simple monetary calculations. Think about the human potential that was squandered, brilliant minds clouded by chronic illness, talented individuals whose creativity was stifled by constant physical discomfort, leaders whose decision-making was impaired by the toxic effects of their lifestyle. How many scientific discoveries were delayed? How many artistic masterpieces were never created? How many political innovations were stillborn because the people capable of producing them were too sick to function at their full capacity? The French nobility was essentially conducting a massive experiment in human degradation, using themselves as test subjects in a study designed to see how much suffering the human body and spirit could endure while maintaining the pretense of civilization. The results were predictably catastrophic, but the subjects of the experiment had become so invested in proving its success that they couldn't acknowledge the obvious failure. Perhaps most tragically, this wasn't a system imposed by external enemies or natural disasters. This was self-inflicted suffering, chosen and maintained by people who had every resource necessary to live healthy, clean, dignified lives. They possessed the wealth to build the finest bathing facilities in the world, the knowledge to understand basic principles of cleanliness, and the power to implement any changes they desired. Instead, they chose to live like diseased animals while convincing themselves they were gods. The parallels to modern dysfunction are impossible to ignore. We live in an era where advanced societies regularly adopt practices that future historians will undoubtedly find as bizarre and self-destructive as we find French noble hygiene. The specific manifestations change, but the underlying psychology remains constant. The human capacity for rationalization, the tendency to mistake suffering for virtue, the willingness to defend obviously harmful practices when they're wrapped in the language of tradition or sophistication. The French nobility's hygiene practices weren't an aberration. They were an extreme example of patterns that repeat throughout human history. Every civilization has its own version of perfumed filth, its own elaborate justifications for self-destructive behavior, its own ways of turning obvious problems into badges of honor. The servants who cleaned up after these nobles, the physicians who documented their decline, the foreign visitors who witnessed their degradation, all of them left records that should have served as warnings to future generations. But each new cohort of leaders seems determined to discover for themselves the limits of human tolerance for self-imposed suffering. What makes the French example particularly instructive is how completely it contradicts our romantic notions about historical aristocracy. We imagine past elites as living lives of unimaginable luxury and refinement, but the reality was often the opposite. The people with the most resources often lived in the most dysfunctional conditions, not because they lacked alternatives, but because they had convinced themselves that dysfunction was actually superiority. This wasn't poverty or ignorance. This was wealth and education corrupted by ideology into something worse than either. A poor peasant who couldn't afford soap at least knew that cleanliness was desirable. A French duke who could afford to bathe in liquid gold chose instead to marinate in his own filth, because his culture had taught him that this represented the highest form of human achievement. The lesson isn't that wealth and power inevitably corrupt, but that they can create conditions where corruption becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. When you're surrounded by people who depend on you for their survival, when your slightest whim becomes law, when your most obviously flawed ideas are treated as divine inspiration, it becomes easy to lose touch with basic reality. The French nobles who created and maintained these hygiene practices weren't evil people. They were human beings trapped in a system that had evolved to protect itself rather than serve its stated purposes. They had inherited traditions that made no sense, but they lacked the intellectual courage to question inherited wisdom or the moral strength to admit that their ancestors had been wrong. The perfumed courts of France collapsed not because of external invasion or natural disaster, but because they had become so disconnected from reality that they couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. When the revolution came, it swept away not just political structures, but entire ways of thinking about human dignity and social organization. The revolutionaries who stormed Versailles found a palace that embodied everything wrong with the old regime. Magnificent architecture housing degraded humanity, incredible wealth squandered on elaborate systems for managing self-imposed suffering, the finest artistic achievements of human civilization serving as decoration for what was essentially a monument to willful ignorance. In the end, the shocking hygiene secrets of French nobility teach us something profound about the human condition. We are capable of convincing ourselves that almost anything is normal, that almost any amount of suffering is acceptable, that almost any level of dysfunction represents sophistication if it's presented in the right way. The same intelligence that allows us to build civilizations can be turned against itself, creating elaborate justifications for practices that destroy the very things we claim to value. The nobles who lived and died in perfumed filth weren't monsters. They were us, given unlimited resources and no external constraints on their behavior. Their story is a warning about what happens when power becomes disconnected from accountability, when tradition becomes more important than truth, and when the ability to rationalize becomes more valued than the willingness to change. The golden halls of Versailles still echo with the footsteps of tourists who come to admire the beauty and grandeur of a lost civilization. But underneath all that magnificence lies a darker truth that human beings are capable of creating hell while convincing themselves they've built heaven, and that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we tell ourselves about our own sophistication. The shocking hygiene secrets of French nobility remind us that progress is never guaranteed, that civilization is always fragile, and that the price of maintaining human dignity is eternal vigilance against our own capacity for self-deception. The perfume has long since faded, but the lessons remain as fresh and urgent as ever.